The Wars of the Roses, known in the 15th century as the Cousins' War, was defined as being a fight between two noble houses of nobility who believed they should be royalty, all except for one woman, who would have an impact not only on the wars themselves but on ending them. Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner who dared to become a queen. Elizabeth's birth even caused a scandal. Her mother was Jacquetta of Luxembourg, a noblewoman from an old Luxembourg family and the daughter of a count. She was first married when she was just 17 to John of Lancaster, Duke of Bedford. Not so common, you say? But John died just 2 years later, leaving Jacquetta a 19-year-old widow with a small fortune now her own. He died in Rouen, but the English king, Henry VI, ordered her to come to England. The man chosen to escort the young Duchess from Normandy was one Sir Richard Woodville, who had been Bedford's chamberlain. On the journey over, and probably afterwards, Jacquetta and Richard fell in love. The problem was that Jacquetta was a duchess, and as the widow of the king's uncle, still honoured as the king's aunt. Richard Woodville was well below her social rank as a knight from a gentry family in Northamptonshire. Jacquetta was also not allowed to get married without permission from the king, but none of this prevented them from secretly getting married sometime before March 1437. And when their secret came out at this time at court, it was explosive. The couple were fined £1,000, but this was cancelled later that same year on the 24th of October. Sometime after 1437, although the exact date is lost, their first child was born, a girl they named Elizabeth. It is suspected that the date of the 24th of October for their pardon may possibly be her birth date, or possibly the birth date of their first child, even if that wasn't Elizabeth. The family moved to Grafton Manor in Northampton, and it was around this time they began to become more prominent. Henry VI had become king before he was even 1 year old in 1422, and by 1430 his mother, Catherine of Valois, had retired from her son's household and secretly married Owen Tudor. This meant until 1445, when Henry VI married Margaret of Anjou, there was no main female presence at court. As soon as the new queen was settled in, Jacquetta was able to rise to prominence at her kinsman's court. Her husband Richard did well too, becoming a baron and later a knight of the Garter. The Woodvilles were on the up. But the coming years would prove difficult. In July 1453, Henry VI fell into a stupor from which he would not awaken for a year and a half, only coming back to life on Christmas Day 1454. During this period of semi-consciousness, the king was unable to acknowledge the son Margaret of Anjou gave birth to, or take any part in ruling his kingdom. Margaret of Anjou put in a bid to hold power while her husband was unable, but the idea of a female regent was still unthinkable in England, and instead the protectorate of the kingdom was handed to Richard, Duke of York. The Duke of York held a claim to the English throne through both of his parents, and he was politically ambitious. The tension between the houses of Lancaster and York grew, and this was the background against which the Woodville family would grow up. Elizabeth's childhood is mostly a mystery, but her intelligence and political decisions in later life would suggest she was at least given a grounding in the basics of reading, writing, something of political ideas, and the womanly pursuits of dancing, music and needlework, like most daughters of the gentry. There is some suggestion that she may have been a lady-in-waiting to Margaret of Anjou as Isabel Lady Grey, Isabel being a short form of Elizabeth. However, she was unlikely to have been old enough for this position, and there were other ladies of the same name. While she was still only a teenager, Elizabeth married her first husband, Sir John Grey. Again, little is known about their marriage, except that John was likely just a few years older than his bride, and their first son, Thomas Grey, was probably born around 1455. Another son, his birth date unknown, followed, Richard Grey. But by 1461, Elizabeth became a young widow with 2 sons to look after when her husband John died at the Second Battle of St Albans. Her mother-in-law, Lady Ferrers of Groby, had remarried and disliked the idea of allowing Elizabeth to have her jointure of 100 marks after John's death. Elizabeth and her father fought this, taking the matter to court and winning. It's the first hint we have in records of Elizabeth's willingness to fight for her survival. 1461 was also the year in which Henry VI was deposed for the first time from the English throne, but not by Richard, Duke of York. Successive wars and York's ambitions for the throne would be realised not through himself, but through his son, Edward, Earl of March. He was now crowned as Edward IV of England, and so began the first rule from the House of York. It's not known, unsurprisingly so far of course, exactly when Elizabeth and Edward met. Some sources suggest it was during social occasions at court before he became king. Others claimed they dined together so often that Edward fell in love with her. The Burgundian chronicler Warren claimed Edward fancied Elizabeth so much it was the reason he pardoned her father and brother for fighting for the House of Lancaster. The traditional story is that Elizabeth found out when Edward would be hunting in Whittlebury Forest. She stayed under an oak tree with her 2 sons to beseech the king to restore their inheritance. And when Edward saw the lovely widow with her 2 sons, he apparently fell instantly in love. Which leads to Elizabeth's reported beauty. She was called the most beautiful woman in England, but we don't really know much about what she actually looked like. Contemporary images suggest she had blonde hair and heavy-lidded eyes. Others spoke of her charm and wisdom as well as her beauty, but how much of this is normal, flowery descriptions of queens and how much is reality is difficult to know, but there are plenty of chroniclers confirming she was very attractive. For Elizabeth's part, Edward himself was over 6 foot tall with light brown hair and known as very handsome at the peak of medieval youth at 22 years old. Of course, Edward used his charms on the female population, and he was known already for having mistresses. But rather like the famous Anne Boleyn over a century later, Elizabeth set a trend and refused to share Edward's bed unless they were married. Some stories had her threatening to kill herself rather than give up her virtue so easily, but these seem concocted for dramatic effect. On a date commonly presented as the 1st of May, 1464, the couple were married in a quiet ceremony, only attended by the priest, the man who helped the priest and sang, Elizabeth's mother, Jacquetta, and 2 unknown gentlewomen. It's possible the date was wrong as well and is simply a romantic later addition. The wedding could easily have been as late as September, which makes sense in light of Edward not revealing his wedding until late September 1464. Even if it was only a small break between his wedding and breaking the news, Edward must have known his marriage would cause controversy. And it did. He announced his marriage only when his council pushed for him to marry a French princess, Bona of Savoy. Elizabeth was not a foreign princess, so could bring no alliances or lands to the table, and worse than this, she was a widowed woman of 2 existing children. It was not what was expected of a king, and the people of England were apparently not in favour of his choice. In truth, while it was a shock for the nobility, it's actually likely most of Edward's subjects might have favoured an English queen after their dislike of Margaret of Anjou. And most of the sources claiming everyone's horror, including that of Edward's mother, were written after his relationship with many of his courtiers had gone south. But Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, was openly disappointed that, as a close advisor of Edward, the marriage hadn't even been discussed with him, and that the chance for a strategic marriage was now gone. Although Elizabeth didn't bring any lands with her, as one of 12 surviving children, she brought a slew of relatives to integrate with Edward's new reign. Her unmarried sisters were all given advantageous marriages to courtiers in the new king's favour, but the most scandalous marriage was that of her only unmarried brother John Woodville, who in his 20s married the twice-widowed Catherine Neville, Duchess of Norfolk, who was in her 60s. Elizabeth's eldest son, Thomas Grey, also married Lady Anne, a niece of the new king. Warwick was further angered by this, as his nephew George had originally been placed to become her new husband. Only one of these new spouses were apparently unhappy with this arrangement, and this was Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham. Many years later, when Richard III took the throne, Buckingham would claim he was unhappy with his marriage to Catherine Woodville, the sister of the Queen, because she was a commoner. In other words, the Woodville family made sure they were firmly in the New Yorkist regime through Elizabeth's marriage. This wasn't any different to any other family that grew close to the throne, but there were nobles who disliked it purely because the Woodvilles were seen as commoners, and they reacted the way nobility has always behaved when their position was threatened. On the 26th of May 1465, Elizabeth was crowned Queen at Westminster Abbey, travelling from the Tower of London in white cloth of gold, with her hair loose down her back in the traditional manner. It wasn't long after this that Elizabeth also fulfilled her duty as Queen by discovering she was pregnant. The first child born to the royal couple was a girl, also named Elizabeth, on the 11th of February 1466. She was just the first of 10 children Elizabeth would go on to have, 9 of them surviving beyond infancy. After her first child was born, Elizabeth was noted by a Bohemian nobleman named Gabriel Tetzel from Nuremberg to have taken part in a grand silent feast after returning from her churching ceremony. He described how it took 3 hours, each meal more grand than the rest, and that even the Queen's mother and King's sister had to kneel before Elizabeth until she had eaten. Tetzel never once mentions that he was repulsed by this behaviour, but this was used by later writers to suggest the anxiety and vanity of the new Queen. In reality, this was just a really over-the-top ceremony to celebrate the safe birth of Edward's first healthy child, not an everyday occurrence. There is plenty of evidence that Elizabeth and her ladies-in-waiting in fact ate together quite normally most of the time, and that she was happy to dance and talk with them. But no matter whether the Queen's reputation was good or bad, one man was still determined to push the Woodville family back under the rock they'd come out of. Conspiring with his future son-in-law, the Earl of Warwick this time tried to use one of the oldest tricks in the book to slander a woman. He accused Jacquetta of Luxembourg, and by extension of his claim, Elizabeth Woodville, the Queen, of witchcraft. He claimed that the only way a marriage between Edward and a commoner could possibly have taken place was that a spell had made him do it. There was no evidence, except for some dodgily made figurines that a man named Thomas Wake, a follower of Warwick, claimed Jacquetta made to represent the king's family, and then just left them lying around. Contrary to what some popular fiction writers would have you believe, most people saw the claims as complete bunk, and the charges were thrown out by the King's Great Council on the 21st of January 1470. Richard III would later try to revive these charges in 1484, but with absolutely no proof either. In 1467, Edward IV dismissed his Chancellor George Neville, the Archbishop of York, who just happened to be the brother of Richard Neville. Warwick responded to this by going behind Edward's back and striking up an alliance with Edward's brother, George, Duke of Clarence. Knowing something was going on, Edward tried to prevent a marriage between Warwick's daughter Isabel and George, but George decided to go ahead with the wedding anyway, becoming Warwick's son-in-law. Obviously, tensions were running high. Looking elsewhere for support, Warwick went behind Edward's back again and knelt at the feet of Margaret of Anjou, promising to restore Henry VI to the throne. He and George led a rebellion against Edward and forced the king to abandon his throne and flee to Flanders in September 1470. Luckily for Edward, when he arrived in Burgundy, it was ruled by his brother-in-law, Charles the Bold, who was married to his sister Margaret of York. Eventually, the pair persuaded the Burgundian Duke to help by providing men and ships, and Edward prepared to return to England. While he was away, Elizabeth did not stand still to see what would happen, but instead took herself and her children to Westminster Abbey, claiming sanctuary there. It was a smart move on her part, as Elizabeth knew the tide had turned, and neither side wasted any time in removing those that stood in their way. It was here that she would give birth to her first son with Edward, a boy also named Edward after his father, and the new heir for the crown of England. Henry VI's second rule, sadly, was not a return to good form, but a continuation of a chaotic government. He still remained plagued by a mysterious mental illness that rendered him unable to carry out his duties, and Warwick and Clarence found themselves, unsurprisingly, pushed out by the reinstatement of the Lancastrian regime. But Elizabeth didn't have to wait long for events to overturn. The elder Edward returned in March 1471, starting in Hull and taking the city of York, before moving south to the city of London. Reminded of what rule under Henry VI was like, the city gates were opened to him, and he was reinstated as Edward IV. Henry VI was sent to the Tower of London for the second time, and died under suspicious circumstances, in which one chronicler claimed he died of melancholy, but it was more like suffocation with a pillow. Elizabeth was returned to her status as Queen Consort, and she left the abbey with her children and life intact. But it was bittersweet, as she had also lost her brother John and her father, now Earl Rivers, when they were taken prisoner after the Battle of Edgecote and beheaded at Kenilworth. On the plus side for the Yorkists, the Earl of Warwick was killed at the Battle of Barnet in April 1471, and the remaining Lancastrians who didn't see the benefit of changing sides were finished off at Tewkesbury, along with Henry VI's only child, Edward of Westminster. Elizabeth slipped comfortably back into her role as Queen Consort. Visitors to the English court now praised not only her beauty, but her intelligence and piety as well. She made several pilgrimages, founded the chapel of St Erasmus in Westminster, and became a patroness of Queen's College, Cambridge, the college founded by Margaret of Anjou. In a time of relative peace, Elizabeth obviously wanted to create a new memory of the royal family as good examples of pious people leading their country with dignity. But tragedy was just around the corner. In 1483, Edward IV's health began to fail, and on the 9th of April 1483, he died at the age of 40. Elizabeth was a widow for the second time. Edward had named his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as the protector of England and regent until his son Edward, then only 12 years old, came of majority age. The Woodvilles had never got on well with Richard, and they were well aware that their rise to power would be quickly reversed if Gloucester got hold of the young prince. They moved quickly to bring Edward V, as he was now known, to London. In order to give them time to act, Elizabeth chose not to tell Richard about the death of his brother. While these actions may have been Elizabeth trying to maintain her own position, her son's position, and that of her family, it was interpreted by some as the actions of a family ready to get rid of Gloucester. But Richard was tipped off by a close friend of Edward IV's, Lord Hastings. Richard promptly rode to meet up with his nephew Edward and arrested the relatives travelling with him. These were the new king's half-brother Richard Grey and his uncle Anthony Woodville, and they were summarily held without a trial and executed at Pontefract on the 25th of June. Richard wasn't messing around. As soon as Elizabeth heard her son had been intercepted, she once again fled to the safety of Westminster Abbey with her remaining children. Richard managed to convince her to give up her younger son Richard of Shrewsbury to be with his elder brother in the Tower of London, where Gloucester claimed he was getting ready for his coronation. It would never come. In events that are well documented elsewhere, including in 2 of my other videos, the princes would disappear into the Tower of London and never come out in public again. Then Richard went further by claiming Elizabeth and Edward IV had never legally been married. In the dramatic theatre show of the century, Richard III and the Duke of Buckingham claimed to have evidence that Edward IV had actually been promised in marriage to one Eleanor Butler before he married Elizabeth Woodville, and therefore their marriage was invalid. Coincidentally, Eleanor Butler was also dead, and so was unable to refute or corroborate the claims. With a lot of fear tactics and strong-arming, the King's Council agreed that the marriage was invalid, thus making all Edward's children illegitimate and unable to take the throne. Thankfully, it was pointed out that Richard was luckily able to become king, and he put on a good public show of resistance, but not too hard since he became Richard III. Elizabeth was now referred to simply as Dame Elizabeth Grey and stripped of all her entitlements and lands. It was around this time it became clear that something very wrong had happened to her 2 young sons, and while their bodies were never found, it was assumed Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury were dead. They were 12 and 9 years old respectively. While some hope always remained over the coming decades that they were alive on the continent somewhere, it seemed more likely in the bloody aftermath of the Cousins' Wars that they had been disposed of. Elizabeth never recorded her feelings on the matter, but other sources state that when she was told, it broke the poor woman. She fell to the floor screaming and tearing at her hair, cursing herself for ever letting her younger son go to his brother. It fueled her next steps. Elizabeth Woodville was not the sort of woman to step down in the face of defeat, and she now started to conspire with the Duke of Buckingham. Buckingham had fallen out with his best mate Richard III over an unknown matter, and now he wanted him off the throne as much as Elizabeth. They both allied themselves with Margaret Beaufort, the Countess of Richmond, who was secretly working to return her son Henry Tudor to England. While Margaret had originally intended only to get Henry home and restored to his father's titles of Earl of Richmond, it quickly became clear that through conquest and a tenuous link to John of Gaunt, Henry Tudor had a chance at taking the throne. Elizabeth Woodville now played her trump card. She suggested that if Henry returned to England and took the crown, he could marry her eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York. Elizabeth of York technically had the stronger claim to the throne, but the fact there had never yet been an uncontested female regnant meant her claim could be joined to Henry's to make his own stronger. Elizabeth Woodville used all of her contacts and allies to raise funds and men to aid Henry Tudor in exchange for this promise. Publicly, on the 1st of March 1484, Elizabeth finally left her daughters after Richard III, also publicly, promised they would be unharmed and that the daughters would have good marriages to gentlemen. The girls had been raised as princesses, but in the circumstances, any marriage looked good over an uncertain future. Elizabeth agreed in public, but secretly continued to raise men and cash for Henry's return to England. When in April 1485 Richard's wife, Anne Neville, died, rumours had to be squashed that the king was planning on marrying his niece Elizabeth of York. It was enough to spur Henry Tudor on, and he came to England's shores that summer. On the 22nd of August 1485, he met Richard's forces at the Battle of Bosworth. A bloody battle ensued, but aided by his stepfather, Thomas Stanley, Earl of Derby, and his men, Henry Tudor was victorious. Killing Richard on the battlefield, the young man was proclaimed Henry VII of England. As soon as he was firmly established at court, Henry revoked the Titulus Regius, destroying all copies of it and proclaiming the children of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville once again legitimate. This also allowed him to marry Elizabeth of York and add her claim to the crown to his own, as it was largely agreed that her brothers were no longer around to take that claim themselves. Elizabeth was once again reinstated and now became Queen Dowager. However, there were two women at court to contend with now for first place. The first was Margaret Beaufort, who after a long fight to get her son home, placed herself uniquely as his right-hand woman as the king's mother. The second was her own daughter Elizabeth of York. Many of Elizabeth Woodville's lands and properties were taken away from her, and this has sometimes been read as proof Henry did not trust her, but it's far more likely these were traditional lands meant for the Queen Consort of England. In other words, the torch was merely being passed over. Elizabeth Woodville was now 50 years old, elderly in medieval terms. While there is debate over how much of the decision was hers, Elizabeth decided to retire to Bermondsey Abbey on the 12th of February 1487. It's possible Elizabeth had always had plans to retire there. One of her ancestors was connected with the abbey, and previous regal inhabitants meant there was already a lovely set of royal apartments for her use. But it's equally possible that she was given a nudge to retire perhaps a little earlier, probably by Henry VII or Margaret Beaufort. But the popular idea of Margaret Beaufort being the alpha woman pushing the former queen who outranked her from court seems highly unlikely, given Elizabeth of York wasn't afraid of confrontation and would definitely have protested against such treatment of her mother if the Dowager Queen didn't want to go. Not only that, but during her years at the Abbey, not only was Elizabeth Woodville given a pension of £400 a year, but Henry VII would often send his mother-in-law gifts. Elizabeth was treated with all due respect during her comfortable stay at Bermondsey, but she often came to court to visit as well. In November 1489, Elizabeth was present to see the birth of her granddaughter Margaret, and in 1486 and 1491 for the births of her grandsons, Arthur and Henry respectively. On the 24th of September 1486, Elizabeth was the godmother for her grandson Arthur, and so was part of his christening ceremony. The new Queen Elizabeth would come visit her mother, as would her sister Cecily of York. In other words, even in retirement, Elizabeth Woodville didn't lose her relevance to the royal court. This was confirmed when Henry VII briefly considered marrying his mother-in-law to James III of Scotland to create a union between the two countries, only broken off when James III died in battle in 1488. Elizabeth Woodville wouldn't be long for the world herself. On the 8th of June 1492, the Queen Dowager died. In her will, she said that she only wanted a simple funeral, but the lack of pomp would later be attributed to Henry VII as he became ever more careful with finances over the years, some pointing to the funeral as proof he didn't really like her. In reality, everyone was happy to go with her wishes. Apart from Elizabeth of York, who was expecting her 4th child, all of Elizabeth Woodville's daughters were present. Elizabeth was laid to rest beside her husband, Edward IV, in St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. In the centuries after her death, Elizabeth Woodville's character would be subject to a strange, nebulous version of her that was often contradictory. At times, she could be shown as an intelligent political woman who moved quickly to protect her children. Other times, she was portrayed as a calculating, manipulative queen who used her feminine charms to rise too far above her station. She was even portrayed at times as a witch. But the truth is that Elizabeth Woodville was a fighter. Brazenly ignoring the insults of the court, she married for love, and no doubt saw an opportunity to raise herself to the status of a queen from a knight's daughter. But who wouldn't? Her family were no more opportunists than the other noble families, and they were only looked down upon due to their social status. Elizabeth was a clever woman who knew to surround herself with allies, and when those allies were in short supply, she used the position of others, such as Margaret Beaufort needing to return her son home, to her advantage. And despite the uncertainty and loss in her life, especially surrounding her 2 sons in the Tower, she still ensured her daughters would survive. Elizabeth Woodville wasn't merely a commoner who rose to be a queen. She was a woman who thrived as a queen and became one of the pivotal women in the Wars of the Roses. Margaret of Anjou was destined for royalty and greatness from birth, but she would go on to prove herself a powerful politician, a formidable queen, and capable of leading armies, despite being a woman in the 15th century. And her actions would form the nucleus of the bloody Wars of the Roses. Margaret was born on the 23rd of March 1430 in Pont-à-Mousson or Nancy in Lorraine. She was the second daughter of René, Duke of Anjou, also known as Good King René, and Isabella, Duchess of Lorraine. She would not be an only child, as she also had 5 brothers, 4 sisters, and 3 half-siblings from her father's affairs with mistresses. Margaret certainly wasn't raised to be anything but a queen, as her family were part of the web of royal and noble connections that spread across Europe, and her father would even be King of Naples for 7 years. But other examples in her family would have a greater impact on the young Margaret. Her mother, Isabella, was the only surviving child in her family, and so ruled the duchy in her own right. But more than this, when her husband René was held captive by the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, it was Isabella who ruled Naples in his stead. She even took control of an army to repel competitors to her husband's throne. Margaret's paternal grandmother, Yolande of Anjou, also acted as regent in Anjou during her son's captivity, repelling English forces. She also protected the Dauphin when his life was threatened, keeping him safe in her lands, and he would later become Charles VII and her son-in-law. Margaret therefore had more than one example in her family of strong female governance. No doubt this had a great effect on her. While women were still secondary players in their lives alongside the men they lived with, royal women in Western Europe were slightly different. They were able to hold political and regal power when there was no male presence for the role, whether this was temporary or not. In France, this was partly down to ancient Salic law saying that women could not inherit the throne. This meant they could hold the power of the throne without threat. It was not the same in Britain, where women were expected to be subordinate to their husband at all times. The idea of a woman holding authority was not news to Margaret. We also know Margaret had a tutor who also taught her brothers, arranged by her mother, so she was certainly well educated, and the young French noblewoman had a penchant for hunting and chivalric romances. After a few marriages suggested that didn't come to fruition, a marriage was finally agreed between Margaret and the King of England, Henry VI. This agreement would be hammered out over 5 years, from 1439 until 1444, with hopes that the union would stop the wars between England and France. Margaret was just 14 when she was formally betrothed to Henry by proxy on the 24th of May, whereas her prospective groom was 23 years old. There was only a small dowry of 20,000 crowns and some claims to a few small lands on Margaret's maternal side, but the real promise was the 23-month truce with France. People were very divided about the marriage, but the promise of peace was a good lure. This theme of Margaret bringing peace would continue as the government strove to raise money to transport their king's bride to England, the cost offset by the promise of peace with France. On the 9th of April 1445, Margaret finally reached the shores of her new country, but she was too ill to take part in the celebrations for her arrival. She instead stayed in Southampton to recover, and the Milanese ambassador reported that supposedly the young king, anxious to see his new bride, visited her secretly. Whether or not that really happened, Margaret was well enough by the 22nd of April for the marriage ceremony at Titchfield Abbey, Henry giving his new bride the gift of a gold ring set with a large ruby. Margaret made her formal state entry into London on the 28th of May. As with all new queen consorts entering the city, Margaret was regaled with pageants and festivities, as well as plays, yet again enforcing the message that the marriage would create a lasting relationship between France and England. It's possible Margaret was a little nervous at the continued pushing of this message, or perhaps with the confidence of youth, she agreed. The problem was that when the French embassy arrived in London that summer to hammer out the details, the talks were indecisive. This was made worse by Henry VI carrying out diplomatic talks of his own without including his advisors, and often making decisions that went against theirs. On Christmas Day 1445, Henry wrote a letter to Charles VII of France, his wife's uncle and the French king. He offered to surrender Maine to René of Anjou by April of the following year, which would give Charles a reason to go to war a few years later. Margaret was given instruction from Charles's advisors to assist the peace process by encouraging her husband to keep his promise. While Henry later acknowledged her involvement, he would also make it clear that he would always personally prefer peace over war. Unfortunately, while Maine was given up, René never created the alliance he had promised. This started rumours that Maine had actually been given up as part of Margaret's marriage settlement, not helped by the knowledge that she had tried to mediate for her husband. She was set up with an income fit for a queen, estates, a grant from Parliament, and an annuity all added up to over £10,000 a year. Plus, she was allowed to ship wool from any port in the realm, free of customs. Margaret's gifted estates were mostly comprised of Tutbury, Leicester and Kenilworth, with other parts of lands near Essex and London, and many older estates in Oxfordshire, Devon, Cornwall and Hertfordshire. Her main lands in the Midlands were to become vitally important in the years to come, for they would form the main power base for the Queen. There is little evidence for the beginning of Margaret's reign, but that really just proves she was behaving exactly as a late medieval queen should have been. Basically, she was supporting her husband, and Margaret's main role lay in being a patroness. Her other role was to produce a royal heir, but anxiety rose when this did not immediately happen. However, she and Henry seemed happy together, and they spent much of their free time together by their own choice. The couple found they shared an interest in culture and education, and in 1448, Margaret was given permission to found Queen's College, Cambridge, a college that exists to this day. She helped arrange marriages for members of her own household. Some of her own French ladies-in-waiting married into the king's household. She intervened on behalf of judicial matters by letter and sorted the collection of arms. There is little evidence of the strong warrior queen who would come later. It was also around this time that Margaret formed a close relationship with William de la Pole, the Duke of Suffolk, and his wife Alice Chaucer. He had helped arrange the marriage between Margaret and Henry, and in later years after his downfall, ugly rumours would spread that Margaret and Suffolk had an affair, but there is no evidence for this. It's much more likely that, especially with the age gap between them, Suffolk and his wife became father and mother figures for the young queen, especially in a country where many were hostile to her simply because of her nationality. At last, in early 1453, 9 years after getting married, Margaret was able to tell Henry that she was pregnant. People were overjoyed that at last the king had an heir on the way. Henry's kingship, for the time being at least, felt a little stronger for the news. But then, disaster struck. In August, after complaining one evening of feeling sleepier than usual, Henry VI had awoken in a stupor, his head lolling and unable to communicate with anyone. After weeks of 15th century medicine, including exorcism, bleeding and cautery, it appeared the king was conscious but unable to conduct business in court. It is now thought he suffered from catatonic schizophrenia or severe depression, either one being a mental condition he may have inherited from his maternal grandfather, Charles VI of France. In October, Margaret had no choice but to go into her confinement, and on the 13th of October, a healthy baby boy was born, named Edward. The little prince, sadly, could not be acknowledged by his catatonic father, and whispers of the Queen's infidelity rose their head once more. But Margaret had bigger things to worry about. With her husband unable to rule, and their son only an infant, she had to accept that the reins of government were likely to be in the hands of one of the many competing nobles at court. However, this didn't stop her in January 1454 from drawing up a bill of 5 articles outlining her own bid to be regent. While things were different in England, no doubt Margaret was pulling from her own experience, watching her mother and grandmother rule in the stead of their absent husbands. But the person chosen to be Lord Protector was instead Richard Plantagenet, the Duke of York. Contrary to popular opinion, there is little evidence that Margaret immediately regarded York as an enemy, and at first was okay with his protectorship. But York was an intelligent, politically ambitious man who held a claim to the throne through both of his parents. Prior to this, it can be seen that Margaret considered both Richard and his wife Cecily Neville fondly, as they were recipients of many of her gifts, and the two women exchanged letters. However, the Duke of York had an enemy at court who would become an ally of the Queen's, Edmund Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset, who was the leader of the House of Lancaster at court. No doubt Somerset used his friendship with the Queen to turn her further against York. Finally, on Christmas Day 1454, Henry VI seemed to awaken from his catatonic state. He acknowledged joyfully that he was indeed the father of Prince Edward, and Margaret must have breathed a sigh of relief. But things got a little difficult when York had to be extricated from his protectorship. Many of the nobles who had grown in power under his leadership stated they were disaffected with the current state of affairs, and York used this as a way to be rid of his long-time enemy, the Duke of Somerset. A great council was called, to which the Duke of York was not invited, near St Albans. Using the excuse that he was on the king's side but wanted rid of the apparently corrupt Somerset from government, York marched his forces towards Somerset and Henry, meeting them outside the town and kicking off the first battle of St Albans. The two houses were now at each other's throats. There were few casualties, but Somerset was killed, along with other leading Lancastrian nobles. The king was captured and Henry was taken back to London, a prisoner in theory, but publicly still ruler of his kingdom. York couldn't risk the king dying, as then the crown would simply pass to his son Prince Edward. With the death of the head of the Lancastrian faction, Margaret's dislike of York, and her household made up of the remaining Lancastrian nobles who sided with her husband, the Queen found herself now heading the House of Lancaster for Henry. The Duke of York named himself Constable of England, and so began his second protectorate, as he claimed for at least part of it that the king was once again ill. However, when Henry recovered in February 1456, York was forced once again to give up power. Henry seemed resigned to the fact that the Yorkist nobles around him would play a part in his government, but judging by his quiet, kind personality, he probably hoped for some sort of peace to be found in compromise. In March 1458, he attempted to force peace between the two houses by holding a love day, in which Margaret of Anjou and the Duke of York even walked hand in hand along the streets of London. It was all for show, however, and secretly both sides had been building up their forces. In April of that year, the Queen went with her young son to Coventry and the royal palace of Kenilworth, joined later by Henry. She then went on a tour of her Midland estates with Prince Edward, ensuring the loyalty of the noblemen based there. It proved to be necessary. Tensions bubbled over, and on the 10th of July 1460, the Battle of Northampton erupted on a field near the River Nene. Before the fighting began, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick and later to be known as the Kingmaker in the 19th century, sent a message to the king. The rebels stated that they merely wished to talk to the king to settle their dispute, but in a surprising show of taking charge, Henry refused. After gaining access to the Lancastrian camp, the battle took a mere 30 minutes, and many of the lead Lancastrians, such as Humphrey Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham, were killed trying to prevent the Yorkists advancing on Henry VI. Margaret of Anjou and their 7-year-old son Edward were present in the camp, and as they saw the oncoming army, they were forced to flee. We have no way of knowing exactly how Margaret felt about leaving her husband behind, knowing Henry would almost certainly be captured. We also don't know what words, if any, the couple exchanged before she fled, but it's almost certain that both Henry and Margaret's first thoughts would have been to get little Edward to safety. If he had been captured by the Yorkists, they would have the ultimate leverage. The details of Margaret and Edward's escape are hazy, but it seems they made their way from Coventry to Wales and from there to Scotland. Scotland was, at that time, ruled by a female regent, Queen Mary of Guelders, and so Mary was now holding the throne for her 6-year-old son, James III. Her position with the events in England were mainly to keep playing the two sides against each other, but her chief advisor, Bishop James Kennedy, wanted an alliance with their southern neighbours. When Margaret arrived over Scotland's borders, however, it is almost certain that part of Mary's decision to take them into her home was because Margaret was a mother looking out for her son's interests as she was, a woman fighting through male medieval politics. The two women now both proved they were capable of organising political alliances and decisions on their own. Not only did Queen Mary take young Edward of Westminster into her household to keep him safe, but a marriage alliance was also agreed between the two mothers, that he should be betrothed to Mary's daughter, Princess Margaret. In exchange, Margaret of Anjou agreed to give up Berwick upon Tweed. But almost more importantly, Mary also aided Margaret of Anjou with men, a force made up of Scottish soldiers. Margaret would bolster this by also drawing men from England, represented in the livery of the Prince of Wales. During Margaret's time in Scotland, her principal commander in England had been busy as well. He was Henry Beaufort, 3rd Duke of Somerset after the death of his father, Edmund. On the 30th of December 1460, he gained a major victory for the House of Lancaster at the Battle of Wakefield. His army defeated both the Duke of York and the Earl of Salisbury. In a vicious moment of victory, the two men were not only killed but beheaded, their heads displayed in York on the city walls. Richard Plantagenet's son, Edward, Earl of March, was infuriated by this and became set on revenge. But the victory for the House of Lancaster meant that Margaret was able to be reunited with her husband, King Henry, and they set off towards London. Despite their victory and the Lancastrian nobles still on their side, the King and Queen were denied entry into the capital. Yet again, it was the women involved in the conflict who came to the fore, and the Duchesses of Bedford and Buckingham and Lady Scales tried to mediate with the people of London, attempting to convince them that the Lancastrian army was under control, but to no avail. Instead, when the Earl of March turned up, it became clear which way everything was going, and Margaret and Henry had no choice but to turn back. They retreated back to Scotland as the Earl entered London easily, being crowned as Edward IV. From there, the exiled royal family went to France in 1462, and Margaret found an ally in her cousin, Louis XI, now King of France. In return for Calais, Louis agreed to fund an expedition to England to regain the throne for Henry or Prince Edward. The fleet went to the coast of Northumberland, capturing Alnwick, as well as other nearby estates, but eventually they were all back in Yorkist hands before the year was out. In August 1463, Margaret once again went back to France to do what she could to drum up support, taking Edward with her. Henry VI stayed behind. It was the last time they would see each other. Margaret now went to her father's lands in Nancy, using this as a base to convince the kings of Europe to back the Lancastrian cause, as well as convincing Louis XI. But it wasn't until the marriage of Edward IV's sister, Margaret of York, to Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, that the French king became convinced of throwing his lot in with the Lancastrians against the Yorkist alliance with Burgundy. Richard Neville had by now fallen out with Edward IV over his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, and so in an attempt to regain his political position, he threw himself on the mercy of Queen Margaret. His daughter, Anne Neville, was married to Prince Edward in 1470, but Margaret didn't trust this to be enough of a link, especially as she had taken 2 weeks to be persuaded to go ahead with the marriage. She demanded Warwick prove himself before she would follow him back to England. He immediately set off for Blighty with a fleet of 60 ships, and upon reaching London was able to enter unopposed and set Henry VI free from the Tower of London. It would have seemed all was well now, but in fact Warwick faced difficulties in keeping control of the country under Henry's fading rule. Margaret refused to set foot in England with her son until she could be certain it was safe. The Earl of Warwick had hoped to escort them home himself, but instead he ended up at the Battle of Barnet where he was killed. Margaret had just landed at Weymouth in April 1471 when she heard the news. The tentative short and second reign of Henry VI was over, and he was once again placed as a prisoner into the Tower of London. Margaret, travelling with her daughter-in-law Anne Neville, had no choice but to lead her Lancastrian forces to meet the Yorkist army coming towards them, camping near Tewkesbury. The fighting broke in the morning, and Margaret must have been anxious as her now 17-year-old son Edward was to lead the army into battle. It was a disaster for the Lancastrians. They were soundly defeated, but the worst news was yet to come. Although it's unclear whether he was killed in the fighting or executed after the battle, Margaret and Henry's only child, the heir to the English throne, Prince Edward, died. Sources say that Margaret, staying with her daughter-in-law in a nearby religious house, was told about her son's death. It broke her. It's hardly surprising. Queen Margaret's sole focus since Edward was born had been to secure his place on his father's throne, from trying to keep control while Henry was catatonic, to asking every ruler from Scotland to Portugal and Castile for men and support, to leading her Lancastrian army into battle. And now, her only son, and the Lancastrian hope for England, was gone. Margaret and her ladies-in-waiting were found 3 days later, and Margaret was taken prisoner. She was at first placed in the Tower, taken in a carriage ahead of the king on his triumphant return to the city on the 21st of May. Unfortunately, she would never get to see Henry VI, also in the Tower, as that very night he died. There is still discussion of whether the king died of melancholy, as reported, or, more likely, if someone smothered him with a pillow. But either way, Margaret was now grieving and no longer of any importance as Edward IV once more took the English crown for his own. At the end of 1471, Margaret was placed into the care of Alice Chaucer, but King Edward was keen to be rid of her as he had to pay for her expenses. In 1475, Edward finally negotiated a truce with Louis XI at the Treaty of Picquigny, and part of the agreement was the turning over of Margaret of Anjou. Finally, the former English queen was able to return to France, but she also had to agree to giving up her lands and rights in England. Margaret was technically free, but now couldn't afford anything. She had to exist on the pity of the French king. This continued until 1482, on the 25th of August, when Margaret passed away and was interred next to her parents in Anjou Cathedral. Margaret of Anjou, as the real Red Queen of the House of Lancaster, has for a long time suffered from defamation of her character. Writers such as Shakespeare would influence the historical reports of the Queen well beyond the century. In truth, Margaret was a strong woman with a sharply political mind. She was an unrelenting strategist, willing to take the fight to her enemies. She had originally taken on her role as a dutiful wife very seriously, eventually changing only when the political elements of her husband's rule needed attention. She was a mother in the truest sense of the word, doing everything possible for her son, fighting an entire section of her country she believed to be in the wrong. Margaret had fought for Edward even when it seemed impossible, and she had lived through the loss of her son and husband. Margaret was a strong and able queen who did her duty to the letter, a queen who fought for her husband and then her son's rightful place, and still lost everything. Margaret of Anjou was no she-wolf, but a woman rightly deserving of her place in history.
Anne Neville was only 28 years old when she died, and yet she had been married twice, become Princess of Wales and Queen of England, and played a critical part in the Wars of the Roses. But despite this, there is very little known about Anne, and whether she is a victim or a manipulator has depended very much on who is telling her story. Anne was born into a noble family with big ambitions. Despite being amongst 200 other relations who could claim royal descent at the time of her birth, she came into the world on the 11th of June 1456, the second of two daughters born to Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, and his wife, Anne Beauchamp, Countess of Warwick. Her family were part of the upper nobility, and right from the day she was born, Anne was assured of her family's wealth and lineage being the framework for the course her life would take. Through birth and marriage, the Nevilles were relations to the king and therefore the throne. With no sons born to her parents, Anne and her elder sister Isabel were the sole co-heiresses to their parents' fortune. While nothing was noted by her parents anywhere on this issue, the lack of a son must have been disappointing to them, no matter how loved and wanted their daughters were. Sons were able to carry on the family legacy, name and inheritance. Daughters who inherited everything were absorbed into a future husband's name and fortune and would bring an end to the family line. But Anne Beauchamp, for unknown reasons, seems to have struggled with fertility, and she didn't have Anne's elder sister Isabel until she was 25 years old, and she was nearly 30 when she gave birth to Anne. It may have been something genetic, considering Anne's difficulty in producing children during her married life, resulting in only one son who died young. Her upbringing would have been luxurious and full of comforts. By the early 1460s, thanks to successive inheritances and forfeited properties, Anne's father Richard was the wealthiest nobleman in England, as well as becoming captain of Calais, chief steward for the northern estates of the Duchy of Lancaster, chief forester of the north, and constable and steward to many castles. At that time, the Neville family were in with the Lancastrian royal dynasty currently holding the throne, which at that time culminated in Henry VI. Although Anne was born at Warwick Castle, as both of her parents went to live in Calais when Richard Neville became captain of Calais, it's highly likely Anne was brought up there, at least until she was about 4 years old. This also suggests that while English was her mother tongue, she would also probably have learned to speak French as a second language at a young age, both useful and seen as an accomplishment for a noble lady. The Wars of the Roses began in 1455 before Anne was even born. Henry VI had fallen into a stupor from an unknown illness or condition, rendering him conscious but unable to communicate in any way or run the country. Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York, had taken control of the country by becoming Protector of England, despite the protests of Henry's Queen Margaret of Anjou. When Henry came round from his mysterious condition, York's decisions were undone, and he rebelled against the king, stating he was actually just trying to be rid of nobles around the king who were out for themselves, including his arch-enemy Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. Anne's father Richard became an ally to York, and after the Duke of York was victorious at the Battle of St Albans, he only became more important within the royal circle at court. Richard Neville's position as captain of Calais also gave him control of the largest standing army in England. By 1458, when Anne was still a toddler, her father had established relations with Charles VII, King of France, and Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, which would later serve him well. When he was summoned, along with York and his own father, the Earl of Salisbury, to attend an inquiry in London, Richard Neville instead went towards Ludlow Castle with York and Salisbury. But before he arrived, the Yorkist forces were ambushed by the Lancastrian forces, but it was ultimately a Yorkist victory. By June 1460, with much travelling between England, Calais and Ireland, Warwick joined his comrades in England and captured Henry VI, with York claiming the throne for himself. When he was killed before being able to take the crown of England, it was his eldest living son who was successful in this regard, becoming Edward IV in 1461. Anne would have been raised, like her elder sister, within the household of her mother. Once back in England, Anne, and by proxy her mother and sister, would have spent much of their time divided between the family estates of Warwick Castle and Middleham Castle in the north. However, it would have not merely been Isabel and Anne, but her father's wards as well. These were Francis, Lord Lovell, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who was the younger brother of the new King Edward. All of them would have been taught to at least read and write in English, possibly also Latin, how to ride a horse, and would have attended religious services together. No doubt Anne and Richard would have spent time together, not knowing that one day they would be husband and wife. We do know a little of what Anne looked like. We know she had blonde hair, and that she was described by the family chronicler John Rose as being beauteous and slender when she was a young teenager. While flattery was in constant use when describing noble and royal women at this time, there is no reason to doubt it either, as less than desirable looks were also commented on when they existed. Unusually for Isabel and Anne, there is also no evidence that they were placed into another noble household for part of their upbringing. This was a commonplace occurrence, placing noble children into the household of an aunt or uncle, or the king or queen if high enough nobility. It promoted family ties between otherwise bickering relatives, especially when many travelled abroad or long distance across the country, and could provide a network of friends, future spouses and connections. This is probably because at the time the two girls were old enough for this practice, there was no Queen's household until 1464. By then, Edward IV had married Elizabeth Woodville for his queen, a woman who Warwick disliked. This was partially due to the fact Warwick had tried to arrange a marriage for Edward to a French princess, only to find out he was married to Elizabeth already, and she was considered, by 15th century standards, a commoner. Therefore, it's not likely Warwick would have wanted to place his daughters into Elizabeth's household. However, their father was still a steward in the king's household, and as such they are shown to be present at court events from a young age. Anne from when she was 9 years old in 1465. Their behaviour was always described as impeccable, and their clothes fit for their rank and beautiful, but we know little else. Often it appears they came with Warwick's ward, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, so it definitely shows they spent a lot of time together. But not long after this, family politics became very tricky. In 1469, Anne's elder sister Isabel married George, Duke of Clarence, who was Edward IV's other brother. This was against the king's wishes. Concerned by the growing alliance between Warwick and George, Edward had tried to block the marriage, knowing it would create a possible situation where George and Warwick could take him off the throne, and also meaning he couldn't offer George's hand for a foreign alliance. But George defied his brother by travelling to Calais with his bride-to-be, and the marriage took place there instead. This was bad enough, But the following year in 1470, Warwick became so disillusioned with Edward IV's rule that he switched sides again. He travelled to France to swear allegiance to Margaret of Anjou and her cause for Henry VI and their son, with hopes this would also put his family back in a powerful position. Edward IV had attainted Richard Neville, leaving Warwick with little choice but to create alliances elsewhere. As part of the deal, he arranged a marriage between Anne and Margaret's son, Prince Edward of Westminster. This marriage would allow both the Earl of Warwick and Margaret of Anjou to distrust each other slightly less. A grandchild would help Margaret, and if he helped put Henry VI back on the throne, Warwick could be assured of his estates and goods being returned to him. So on the 25th of July at Anjou, Anne Neville and Prince Edward were betrothed. A dispensation was sent shortly afterwards for their close family ties in the form of John of Gaunt as a great-great-grandfather, and they married around the 13th of December 1470 at Bayeux, when Anne was around 14 years old. Back in England, Warwick had succeeded in placing Henry VI back on the throne, although Edward IV had managed to flee to Burgundy. By April 1471, Anne and her new husband Edward of Westminster, her mother Countess Anne, and Margaret of Anjou arrived back on England's shores. Anne Neville was now not merely a wealthy heiress waiting to become a countess, but Princess of Wales, destined to become a future Queen of England. Sadly, things would not work out well for her first marriage. Edward IV had already returned a month earlier in March, and by April things were going against the Lancastrians. By May, Margaret of Anjou found her army pushed back by Edward's Yorkist forces, and this would result in the Battle of Tewkesbury on the 4th of May. We know that Prince Edward was present as he was actually involved in the fighting, despite this being one of the most disastrous decisions made on the Lancastrian side. Sadly, not only did Margaret of Anjou's army fall, but Edward of Westminster also died in the fighting at just 17 years old. Henry VI was taken prisoner, and Edward IV was once again victorious in taking the throne of England. Anne was likely to have been present as well, and so would have witnessed the death of her young husband. The news of her father's death at the Battle of Barnet on the 14th of April must also have by now reached her, and while there is no record of Anne's reaction, it can be imagined. She had lost her father, her husband, and her life was now in the hands of her family's enemies. She was now no longer a princess, but a widow on the losing side, the daughter and wife of traitors, and was taken prisoner after the battle. However, her saviour was about to come in the form of George, Duke of Clarence. He had been annoyed at Warwick dropping the fight for him to wear England's crown, and so had repaired the relationship with his brother Edward secretly. Anne was brought before the king, who pardoned her, and then she and her mother were placed under George's protection. Warwick's estates and possessions were divided between George and his younger brother Richard, who kept the lands in the north. George was determined, according to the Crowland Chronicle, to conceal Anne as a kitchen maid and prevent her remarriage in order to keep the estates. While George likely did want to keep the entire Warwick estates, it's hardly likely he disguised a noblewoman as a maid. However, an argument then ensued between the two brothers as Richard, Duke of Gloucester, wished to marry Anne. According to the Burgundian chronicler Warren, Richard Neville had actually thought about a marriage between his ward and his daughter Anne in 1464, but had never gone through with it. There is no hard evidence for this, but it wouldn't have been an out-of-place thing to happen with a nobleman's daughter and ward. Whatever the case, Gloucester's determination to marry the younger Neville daughter now likely also came from a place of wanting to maintain her half of the inheritance. Again, through all of this, there are no sources giving us an idea of what Anne's feelings were. When she was placed into the protection of her brother-in-law George and her sister Isabel, it must have been both a relief and difficult, as George had betrayed her father. Equally, when she was probably reacquainted with Richard around Christmas of 1471, how did she feel about him? Did Anne have fond memories of the boy she had played with as a child? Or had the subsequent years of war blackened these memories? Sadly, Anne's feelings were not recorded because they were not important in the medieval world of transaction-like marriage, where a marriage was a contract of lineage and lands more than romance, and Anne would have understood this for both of her marriages. There is a story that she allowed Richard to come and whisk her away to sanctuary at St Martin's le Grand in London, a medieval practice of abducting a bride and then marrying her. Either way, Clarence and Gloucester finally came to an agreement in March 1472, after Richard agreed to renounce his claim to many of the Warwick estates and holdings, keeping only those in the north. However, just a few years later in 1474, Parliament agreed that the two sisters would inherit their father's estates and goods equally, setting aside the claim of both their mother, Anne Beauchamp, and their cousin, George Neville. It's not known exactly when Richard and Anne married, but it was sometime between 1472 and 1474, but most sources agree it was likely sooner in 1472. But what this does show is that Anne was now no passive observer of events happening to her. Widows were legally free of male control, and although she was under the protection of Clarence and her sister, they could not force Anne to do anything. Anne chose not to join a nunnery, not to stay with Isabel's household, but instead to remarry and have a chance at claiming her rightful inheritance. And she made these decisions at just 15 years old. If she wanted to reclaim the wealth and lifestyle to which she was accustomed, Anne's choice of new husband was a good one, as only Gloucester would have been able to one-up his brother. While some modern historians have sought to make this a love match, we cannot possibly know if it really was or not, only that for Anne, it was a sensible marriage. A dispensation was required, however. Anne and Richard were already first cousins, but now they were also related through Anne's first marriage to Edward of Westminster, who was also Richard's cousin, Richard being also related to John of Gaunt as a great-grandson, and as brother-in-law and sister-in-law due to George and Isabel being married. In medieval law, this essentially made them brother and sister, even though we would not see it this way today as they were not blood-related as siblings. On the 22nd of April 1472, a dispensation applied for by Richard was approved. However, this dispensation only covered the 3rd and 4th degrees of consanguinity, such as their connection to John of Gaunt, when as siblings-in-law and first cousins they needed one that covered the 2nd and 1st degrees. In other words, this dispensation was technically not valid when they were married. Amazingly, Richard and Anne decided to marry only on this first dispensation, when they must have been waiting for a second one that would take more petitioning and lobbying, something which flouted medieval canon law. Whatever the case, Anne was unknowingly once again set to become Queen of England. Although now merely the Duchess of Gloucester, events would change dramatically. Around 1473, Anne's mother, the Dowager Countess of Warwick, was allowed to leave her guarded sanctuary in Beaulieu Abbey and came to join her daughter's household at Midlham Castle, where the young couple had based themselves. Sometime between 1473 and 1476, Anne and Richard had their first, and what would prove to be their only, child, a son named Edward of Midlham. Little is known about this event, but perhaps part of the reason for Anne's mother joining her at Midlham could have been her presence during her daughter's childbirth. In December 1476, Anne's sister Isabel died. Her inheritance was passed to George, who himself was executed by Edward IV in 1478, leaving Anne as the main beneficiary. As her husband, Richard was now able to use the estates and titles Anne gained, making them a powerful and wealthy family in their own right. But more was to come. On the 9th of April 1483, Edward IV died suddenly, leaving behind his son as heir and now Edward V of England. The king named Richard as protector and regent for his eldest son, but his widow, Elizabeth Woodville, understood that her family would lose their power and wealth if they didn't have control of Edward V. Richard and the Woodvilles had never got on well together. Hearing of his brother's death from a friend rather than the Queen, understanding what was planned, Richard set out for London and took his nephew into his care. He then placed Edward V and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury into the Tower of London to await Edward's coronation. The coronation never came, and a few weeks later Richard reported he apparently had proof that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid, and as a result, the boys, along with their sisters, were illegitimate. This was accepted reluctantly by a nobility with little choice but to agree, and Richard was declared as Richard III of England on the 26th of June 1483. The decision would later be ratified in Parliament in 1484 in Titulus Regius. He was now king, and Anne, as his wife, was Queen Consort of England. On the 6th of July, both Richard and Anne shared a lavish coronation ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Ironically, the Queen's train was carried by Margaret Beaufort, Countess of Richmond, whose son Henry Tudor would later kill Richard and take the crown for himself as Henry VII. Not long after the coronation, during the couple's royal progress across England, their son Edward was created Prince of Wales on the 8th of September 1483. But this is the point at which we might expect to hear more about Anne as a patron, benefactor, at least in records of courtly life. But it appears Anne had little control over her own affairs. The dower lands normally given to queens were never presented to her, and her income was managed by officers of the king. She occasionally pops up in chancery records for grants, but rarely. Her most well-known patronage is possibly that of portions of her inheritance going to Queen's College, Cambridge. We also know Anne got on well with her mother-in-law Cecily Neville, who was also her aunt, and the two discussed religious matters together. But things soon unravelled. In April of 1484, Anne and Richard's son, Edward of Middleham, died suddenly as his parents were on their way to visit him from Nottingham. The reasons behind his death are uncertain, but it suggested Edward fell ill, not uncommon in the medieval period. According to the Crowland Chronicle, both Richard and Anne were mad with grief and were heartbroken at the death of their son. It's hardly surprising. Not only was there the natural pain of losing a much-loved son, but in all their years of marriage, the royal couple seemed to have struggled to produce any other living children. They had not only lost their son, but their only heir. Rumours abounded that Richard was planning on setting aside Anne and marrying again to secure an heir, something that certainly would have been possible in light of their lack of correct dispensation, but he didn't. However, at Christmas of that year, a comparison was apparently drawn between Queen Anne and Elizabeth of York, Richard's niece, of their looks and how they were dressed. The rumours grew that Richard actually wanted to marry his niece, although there is nothing concrete to back this up. The following year, in 1485, Anne herself grew ill. It's not known exactly what this illness may have been, but it's thought to have possibly been tuberculosis. On the 16th of March 1485, at just 28 years old, Anne died. She was buried at Westminster Abbey, but no monument to her would be made until the 1960s. The rumour mill was in such overdrive that after his wife's death, Richard had to publicly send his niece Elizabeth of York away from court and publicly declare he had no intention of marrying her. Some even suggested he had poisoned Anne, but as she had been ill for some time, again it would seem she probably died of natural causes. There is no reason to doubt whether the marriage was a love match or not, that Richard felt genuine grief at the loss of his wife. He would die himself on the 22nd of August 1485, just a few months later, at the Battle of Bosworth. Anne's life is one typical of a medieval noblewoman, a life told through the deeds, decisions and whims of the men around her. We know nothing of her personal feelings or thoughts, or even of her personality, but we get flashes, tiny hints at who she might have been. Her decision at 15 to remarry to Richard, Duke of Gloucester, her preparedness to marry Prince Edward of Westminster, and her reported good manners and conduct suggest she understood what was expected of her as a noblewoman from a proud family who wanted to continue their legacy. Her decision to leave the protection of George and Isabel and marry a man who was, legally at the time, too close to be safely married to, suggests a girl who knew her own mind and had some spark of independence in her. Even as Queen of England, unlike other consorts, we get very little information about her through patronage. We know she was considered pious like many of her time, and this is partially corroborated by her finding common ground on the subject of religion with her aunt and mother-in-law Cecily Neville. We don't even really know what Anne was like as a mother, but considering her publicly known grief after Edward of Midland's death, we can assume she loved him deeply. Ultimately, Anne remains an enigma, told through the lens of those around her despite being a pivotal part of the Wars of the Roses through her 2 marriages and her inheritance. She left little legacy, but did cram a huge amount of adventure into her 28 years. Wars, 2 marriages, becoming a duchess, a princess and a queen, wealth, social disdain and social popularity, and becoming a mother. While Anne is an enigma, perhaps she is also a reminder of the many medieval women who were integral and important people to those around them, who also lived their lives to the fullest, but due to events outside their control, often remain forgotten. If most people are asked, who ended the Wars of the Roses and how? You will normally get the answer, King Henry VII, when he won the Battle of Bosworth. But he could not have done it alone, and one person was not merely helpful in creating stability in England by Henry's side, but was integral to it: his wife and queen, Elizabeth of York. Elizabeth was the eldest daughter and first child in a new line of Yorkist royalty. Her father, Edward IV, had won the throne through a combination of his father being designated heir by Parliament, being better at the job than Henry VI, and winning the right battles. Her mother, Elizabeth Woodville, was born into gentry despite her mother being nobility, and as such was looked down upon by several at court. Young Princess Elizabeth was therefore a hope for cementing the new dynasty and a symbol of an attempt at stability for England, especially remembering that everyone would have hoped for a boy before she arrived. She was born on the 11th of February 1466, the first princess born to an English monarch in over a century. Her christening was a magnificent affair, held at Westminster Abbey and no expense spared. Her sponsors were her grandmothers, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, the Duchess of Bedford, and Cecily Neville, the Duchess of York, and her cousin Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick. Edward IV gave his wife a jewel that cost £125, around £65,500 in today's money, to mark the occasion of little Elizabeth's birth. In a way, it was unsurprising at the opulence surrounding her birth and christening, as England was a wealthy country at the time. Little was imported except for wine, and exports of tin and wool ensured a thriving economy under her father's rule. As was normal for a medieval royal family, the court was transient in nature, and Elizabeth's parents would have spent their time between several royal residences, at least around 12 or so. Little Elizabeth would have therefore been used to moving around from a very young age, although most of her family's palaces were in London or nearby, and she would have grown up to know the City of London intimately. But it was relationships within the court itself that would have a profound effect on Elizabeth's life. The Earl of Warwick, the kinsman of Edward IV, competed for dominance against the Queen's family, the Woodvilles. Warwick, a born nobleman and having fought alongside Edward's father, saw himself as the natural right-hand advisor to the new king. But Queen Elizabeth was proving, while she wasn't born a princess, she was a capable consort. She was pious and careful with her funds, charitable, and she earned the love and trust of her husband, especially as she turned a blind eye to many of his affairs. This meant Edward trusted her and her family with a large amount of influence, and many of the Woodvilles were placed into prominent positions of power. But Princess Elizabeth wasn't to be an only child, and she was to have 9 other siblings. When her younger sister Mary was born in August 1467, in October Edward granted his eldest daughter the manor of Great Linford in Buckingham for life. In reality, she only had the property until 1474 when it was sold, but the rent would have helped pay for her childhood household. Elizabeth and some of her siblings lived at Sheen Palace in Surrey as a nursery, living in a separate household from her parents. This was a normal medieval practice amongst royalty. It showed both how extravagant they could afford to be by having separate households for their children, and it allowed them to be kept away from London's propensity towards plagues and illnesses. The children would have had meals that included bread and ale, but also meat, fish and butter, and inspiring and moral tales would be read out to them during meal times. Their household also included a page to wait on them and a knight of the trencher. As might be expected, little Elizabeth led a privileged life. At the time Elizabeth was born, education for girls leaned more towards honesty and moral perfection, and this prevailed over academia. However, slowly, society in England was beginning to shift to the idea a woman could be both virtuous and educated. Young Elizabeth would be lucky enough to become one of these educated princesses, and her father especially encouraged her love of books, having collected his own impressive collection of manuscripts and books himself. She was able to read and write in English, and she also understood French, but struggled to converse in it. Alongside this, Elizabeth and her sisters were taught dancing, horse riding, music and needlework. Even royal girls, however, would have been raised to consider themselves the weaker sex, and that the most honourable state for a woman to aspire to was to be successfully married. There also would have been an acceptance that parents, who were to be obeyed until a husband could be obeyed, would choose a suitable husband. For princesses, this was even more important, as marriages, never really about love in the Middle Ages, could be used for political and economic gain for their country. Elizabeth was no different. Facing turmoil and challenges to his rule from the Earl of Warwick and his own brother George Duke of Clarence, Edward needed to bolster himself with friends. Edward created Warwick's brother John Neville as Marquis of Montague and offered Elizabeth's hand in marriage to John's 5-year-old son George. On the 5th of January 1470, the betrothal was made official, and Edward also created the young boy Duke of Bedford. However, it's unlikely this was ever a serious marriage proposal rather than a hasty political solution to an emergency situation. Just a few months later in September, Edward was forced to flee to Burgundy when Warwick turned their dispute into a revolt, and Elizabeth went with her mother and sisters into the safety of Westminster Abbey. Her brother, the first and eldest son born to the king, would be born in Westminster while Edward was in exile. He himself would be called Edward after his father. Edward would return the following year from exile, and once again the royal family was able to return to court. Louis XI had encouraged Warwick, but eventually peace would be found between England and France. In 1475, young Elizabeth was then promised to the French Dauphin, Charles, later to be Charles VIII, which Louis XI agreed to. However, by 1482, the betrothal was called off because it was no longer in France's interests. It is interesting to think on what Elizabeth's thoughts on marriage were. As she grew up, she would have been increasingly aware of her father's indiscretions as well as her mother's calm acceptance of them, although it's likely her mother didn't like it. While there are hints that young Elizabeth would share much of her father's personality, enjoying good food, grand display and fine clothes, she would be faithful to her future husband, Henry VII. On the 9th of April 1483, Elizabeth would suffer the first of many tragedies to come, as her father Edward died suddenly at the age of 40. He was succeeded by his 12-year-old son Edward, now Edward V. In his will, Elizabeth's father stated that she was to be left 10,000 marks, around £1.5 million in today's money, if she married the person her mother and brother deemed best. If she didn't get the money. Edward IV's dying wish was apparently for his youngest brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, to be protector of his son. However, the Woodvilles understood perfectly what would happen if Richard, who they had never got on with, had control of the king. They would lose their power and possibly even have young Edward turned against them. Elizabeth Woodville tasked her brother Anthony Woodville and her son from her first marriage, Thomas Grey, to fetch Edward V to London. However, Richard intercepted them at Stony Stratford and took Edward under his care, separating Anthony and Thomas from him and sending them to Pontefract Castle, where they were later executed for supposedly plotting against the young king. Fearing the worst, the elder Elizabeth took her daughters and youngest son, Richard of Shrewsbury, and went into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. What happened next is one of the greatest mysteries of the Middle Ages. Richard had Edward V and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury placed into the Tower of London to await a coronation that never happened. Instead, the boys were declared illegitimate and their uncle became Richard III, King of England. Not long after, the two boys were no longer seen at the Tower, and it's presumed they were killed or may possibly have escaped to Europe, although this is much less likely. While Dowager Queen Elizabeth would never have proof either way, rumours reached her that her sons were likely dead. Polydore Virgil gives an account of Elizabeth Woodville beating her breast, tearing out her hair and screaming her children's names, cursing herself as a madwoman for believing her son would be safe and delivering her youngest boy to the man who was most likely his murderer. All of this must have been traumatic for the young Princess Elizabeth, who was now 17. Not only had she been separated from her brothers, not only was her father and protector dead, but now her brothers were likely dead as well, and she must have understood this was happening because her mother and her mother's family were disliked by the man who had now taken the throne. To know she was considered part of that faction must have been terrifying, and no doubt she worried not only for her own life, but also for that of her siblings and her mother. And on top of this, Elizabeth Woodville's reaction must have been terrifying to watch and understand. There was also fear about the future. This time, there would be no Edward IV returning to rescue them, and feeding from her mother, Elizabeth would likely have been anxious and grieving. After a while, exacerbated by merchants who sold to those in sanctuary at extremely high prices, Elizabeth and her family were running low on funds, and they had to rely on the charity of the abbot. But there may have been a plan in the works. Polydore Virgil also tells us how Elizabeth Woodville and Margaret Beaufort, mother of the later Henry VII, made contact with one another through their shared physician. An agreement was made that Margaret would provide money and resources, and Elizabeth would use her network to provide supporters, and so Henry Tudor, Margaret's son, would be brought home from his exile in Brittany and France to take the crown from Richard. But there was a condition, that Henry be given the hand of Elizabeth of York in marriage, using her rightful claim to the throne to bolster his own weak claim through John of Gaunt and his right by conquest. Henry didn't have much to offer in return at this stage, with no title and no lands, but he could offer the one thing Elizabeth Woodville craved more than anything: revenge, in the form of Henry being able to raise an army against Richard III. She agreed to the marriage. It's unknown whether Margaret had secretly harboured thoughts of Henry claiming the throne after Edward's death, or if it was something that came about later, but the idea was certainly formalised at this time. She had previously tried to petition Edward for Henry's return to England, and after he died, Margaret attempted the same with Richard. She asked if Henry could return to England, as well as to the title from his father, the Earl of Richmond, and even if he could marry one of Edward's daughters. This request had been ignored entirely. No doubt the younger Elizabeth, while possibly not privy to all details, would have known a lot about this. Not only was she old enough for her mother to confide in her, but the plan itself involved her marriage, and it's likely the Dowager Queen would have discussed this with her. However, something that is never mentioned is whether or not Elizabeth considered herself to be the rightful monarch of England in the wake of her brother's disappearance. While it is true there hadn't yet been a female regnant in England, it wasn't an unprecedented idea. In England itself, in the 12th century, Empress Matilda had been proclaimed her father's heir to the throne, and contemporary to the Wars of the Roses was a female Queen of the Scots, Mary of Guelders, who was also well liked. It's not impossible this thought may have stayed somewhere in the back of Princess Elizabeth's mind. Therefore, marrying Henry was probably also her best chance at being on the throne of England. Word of the proposed marriage between Henry Tudor and Princess Elizabeth spread amongst Yorkist supporters, who had been horrified at Edward IV's children being put to one side, and they readily joined the side of Henry, ironically, a man from the House of Lancaster. Unfortunately, the first attempt at rebellion failed in October 1483, and the conspirators would be set back until August 1485. But in December of 1483, Henry went to Rennes Cathedral on Christmas Day and publicly announced his intention to marry Elizabeth of York as soon as he was king. It was throwing down a double gauntlet, and it united both those from the houses of Lancaster and York, many of whom swore homage to him in the cathedral that morning. But in the meantime, Richard realised he had to change tack. Elizabeth of York was now seen as a politically important woman, and having the Woodvilles hide from him in Westminster Abbey only made Richard look more guilty. He invited Elizabeth Woodville and her daughters back to court, but at first she understandably refused. After much coercion, promises and threats, Richard had to publicly declare in front of his council that he wouldn't harm the Woodvilles and that he would find suitable marriages for Elizabeth's daughters to gentlemen. Not the best for princesses, but perhaps the best expected in the circumstances. In a document that confirmed this, it is notable that there is no mention of the safety of the two princes, suggesting without a doubt Richard knew they were dead. The practical reality is that the Dowager Queen had little choice but to agree and return her girls to court. For her daughters, anger at Richard III and worry about their mother likely mixed with relief at finally being back out in the public world. But by Christmas 1484, rumours were starting again. This time of Richard considering a marriage to his niece Elizabeth of York. His wife, Queen Anne, was severely ill at this point, and many made something of the fact Elizabeth could be compared in looks with Anne. The only child of Anne and Richard, Edward of Middleham, had died in April, and Richard now had no heir. The rumours grew bad enough that once again Richard had to make a public proclamation, this time that he had no interest in marrying his niece. Elizabeth of York was then placed at Sheriff Hutton Castle, but none of it would matter by August of the following year. Henry finally made his move and invaded in July, meeting Richard's forces just outside the town of Market Bosworth. With help from Welsh soldiers and the army brought by his stepfather, Thomas Stanley, Earl of Derby, Henry was victorious, and he killed Richard III on the battlefield. Henry was now Henry VII, King of England. Now, Elizabeth simply had to wait for him to come through on his promise. She didn't have long to wait for the good news. Henry sent messengers immediately to Sheriff Hutton Castle to ensure she was kept safe and tell her the good news, as well as taking her to her mother, Elizabeth Woodville, in London. But Henry wanted to establish himself as having enough claim in his own right to be king without needing to lean on his future bride's bloodline, and so the wedding wasn't hurried. He first had his claim by conquest confirmed by Parliament, adding weight to his weak claim through his mother to John of Gaunt, which was already complex because technically his line from John of Gaunt couldn't claim the throne anyway. But the last few decades had proven that being born to the right family was no certain way to hold a throne, so it helped. But it was marriage to Elizabeth that truly would provide the stability for Henry's claim to the crown. He and his mother, Margaret Beaufort, were from the House of Lancaster, and the main reason Yorkists discontented with Richard had rallied to Henry was because of his proposed marriage to the Yorkist heir, Elizabeth of York. Despite wanting to hold the claim in his own right, Henry did recognise that he couldn't do it alone, and finally the planning began. First, he had to revoke Titulus Regius, the document Richard had pushed through to claim all Edward IV's children were illegitimate. Without removing this document, Elizabeth was not technically a legitimate heir. Removing Titulus Regius also shows Henry, like most other people at the time, truly believed Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury were dead, as otherwise their claim would have superseded his own when proclaiming them legitimate once more. 2 papal dispensations were sent for as Elizabeth and Henry were related to John of Gaunt and his younger brother Edmund of Langley, a local one and one to Rome. The one from Rome confirming the marriage took months to arrive, finally reaching England in March 1486, but the more local dispensation was adhered to first, given in January of the same year. Elizabeth and Henry did meet before their wedding, however. Shortly after his victory, Henry came to see Elizabeth at the Tower of London, where she was staying with her mother, although little is written of their first meeting. It's likely that Henry, who could apparently be charming and witty, but also cautious and careful, showed a more reserved side of himself. He had no idea how much Elizabeth had been involved in the possibility of marrying Richard III, and she represented the old enemy, the House of York. But by all accounts, Elizabeth was pleasant and cheerful with him. There were other meetings after this, as Henry stayed nearby at his mother's property of Coldharbour for a few weeks. An affection seems to have sprung up between the couple. Elizabeth stated she had come to feel great and intimate love and cordial affection for Henry, and during Michaelmas, Henry sent Elizabeth a gift of damask, furs and crimson velvet. On the 18th of January, Elizabeth and Henry finally wed at Westminster. It was a magnificent celebration, with nobles from the House of York and Lancaster filling the seats. Elizabeth was dressed in silk damask and crimson satin, covered with a white cloth of gold kirtle, trimmed with ermine, as well as decked out in sumptuous jewels. It would leave no doubt that the rumours of being illegitimate were not to be thought of. Elizabeth was presented as a princess, becoming a rightful queen consort. The wedding was celebrated up and down the land by a joyful English people. Bonfires were lit, poems were written, songs were sung, and banquets were held throughout London. Over the course of their marriage, a deep and binding love would grow between Elizabeth and Henry. Waking up the next morning, it may now have dawned on Elizabeth that she was finally queen consort and all that came with it. She now had to be not only her husband's wife, but the highest example of womanhood in the land. The most virtuous, charitable and humble woman, while also supporting Henry as king and providing him with heirs. To today's society, this doesn't sound very freeing, but it did come with some wiggle room. While late medieval women were barred from many aspects of life and marriage was rarely equal, there were still ways to wield power. Charitable works, patronage, having the ear of the king, and being political behind the scenes were ways in which a queen could be powerful in her own right. Elizabeth's understanding of her role can be seen in her personal emblem and motto. The motto she chose was humble and reverent, suggesting she knew her place was to be a queenly figure while also being a helpmeet for Henry. But her personal device was to be the white rose of the House of York, which shows she also understood her own importance to the throne of England and as heiress to the House of York. It wouldn't be long before Elizabeth helped to stabilise the throne that balanced on both Henry and herself, as she fell pregnant shortly after they were married. The speed with which she had become pregnant must have seemed to everyone a sign that the marriage was divinely approved. By September of that year, Elizabeth was heavily pregnant with their first child, and the place of the birth would be just as important as whether it was a boy or a girl. She was sent to St Swithin's Priory in Winchester, now known as Winchester Cathedral, as at the time, Winchester was assumed to be the Camelot of Arthurian legends, something Henry was keen to associate his family with, especially as he himself claimed descent from King Arthur. Childbirth was a difficult and painful process for women in the medieval period. While midwives of the time did have some knowledge that looked surprisingly modern, such as herbal baths in the later stages of pregnancy and breathing exercises to help with labour, much hope was put in prayers to saints and the Virgin Mary. The rate of death for women giving birth was so high that the average first marriage was just 5 years long. Elizabeth would undergo this terrifying process 7 times. In the early hours of the morning, just after midnight on the 20th of September 1486, Elizabeth gave birth to a boy. Henry decreed his son would be named Prince Arthur, after his famous supposed ancestor, and although he was a month early, he was strong and healthy. The young boy was the hope of many, seen as the union of the houses of Lancaster and York, the glittering beginning for the Tudor dynasty, and as a boy, the future King of England. As was normal for royal women of the time, Elizabeth would have handed Arthur over to his own household rather than taking care of his daily needs herself. In order to allow her to conceive more quickly, queens did not breastfeed in order to allow their periods to return faster, and Elizabeth would also have to return to ceremonial functions and duties. In the 15th century, good royal mothers ensured their children had a good education, a good household of staff, and later to organise a good marriage. However, after giving birth, Elizabeth was described as having contracted a fever that persisted throughout her lying-in period. This fever would persist for the next few months, and the gap of time between her pregnancies may suggest her ill health affected her very badly. When she finally recovered, she gave a large gift of money to the priory where she had given birth in thanks for her health returning. She also set to work, along with her mother-in-law Margaret Beaufort, in shaping the style and appearance of the court, something which Henry had little knowledge of as he had spent so many years abroad. On the 25th of November 1487, Elizabeth was finally crowned as Queen Consort of England in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. She wore a luxurious kirtle and gown of purple velvet, and a circlet of golden pearls on her head, her hair loose for the occasion as queens were allowed to do even after marriage. As she passed along the runner to her coronation, however, people stepped forward eagerly behind her to snip off pieces of the material she had walked on. This was a prerogative of the common people, and such a souvenir would have been priceless. Unfortunately, the crowd was too forceful, and the ladies behind Elizabeth carrying her train were disordered, and some people were killed in the crush. It must have been horrible to know the chaos that was happening behind her, and yet being ushered into her ceremony at the same time. Nevertheless, the rest of the coronation went without a hitch, Henry and his mother Margaret allowing Elizabeth to take centre stage as they watched from behind a latticed screen. The coronation was followed by a grand banquet of over 51 dishes. Elizabeth would then have settled once again into courtly life. Although she had ceremonial duties, she also would have been expected to do other activities that all women were expected to do, such as embroidering and mending and embellishing clothes. It was Elizabeth who embroidered Henry's King's Garter robe with gold thread, and she employed a French embroiderer named Robinet, who received wages and board. Making items such as shirts, hangings or bedding could be given at New Year's as gifts. Much of her time would also have been spent in trying on and changing into various items of this clothing. As royalty, Elizabeth and Henry were expected to be the best dressed of anyone at court in order to outwardly show their family's prosperity and rank. Despite his reputation as a miser, Henry actually spent lavishly on gifts for his wife and children, and he ensured the more expensive items required for her wardrobe were provided by himself to ease Elizabeth's own finances. Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting would also have been expected to dress almost as well and expensively as she did, and it could be a significant amount of a family's income that went into paying for a woman to be a lady-in-waiting. She was also a great patron of the arts, and Elizabeth never lost her love for books, giving large funds to William Caxton for his printing press. She also loved to give generously to charity, and it was her custom when travelling to distribute alms to the people she passed. Elizabeth also regularly made offerings to saints and shrines. A few months later, Elizabeth was again pregnant. This time, she would give birth to a daughter, Margaret, named for her paternal grandmother and born on the 28th of November. But the joy and happiness at another royal child would be dampened the following year with yet another royal pretender, Perkin Warbeck. He claimed in 1490 at the court of Burgundy to be Richard of Shrewsbury, Elizabeth's younger lost brother, and his similar looks and charming manners soon meant the royal courts of Europe saw an opportunity to use him for their own ends. Ultimately, after more than one attempt to invade England, Perkin was captured in October 1497 by Henry's forces. Henry was initially lenient with Perkin, allowing him to not only reside in the Tower of London but to occasionally appear at court, as well as placing Perkin's wife into Elizabeth of York's household. After Perkin tried a disastrous attempt at escape with the real Earl of Warwick, however, Henry had him executed on the 23rd of November 1499. Little is written of what Elizabeth thought about Perkin, but it's likely she met him in passing at court. If he ever really resembled her lost brother, she never noted it down. Elizabeth would go on to have 5 more children. Prince Henry, who would grow up to become the infamous Henry VIII, born on the 28th of June 1491, a daughter named Elizabeth after her own mother, who was born on the 2nd of June 1492, but sadly died while still a toddler. Princess Mary, born on the 18th of March 1496, who would become the grandmother of Lady Jane Grey. Edmund, Duke of Somerset, who was born on the 21st of February 1499, but died while still a baby the following year. And her final pregnancy was Catherine, born on the 2nd of February 1503, who would live only a few days. It's clear that as the years went on and Elizabeth went through successive pregnancies, it began to take its toll on her body, especially in a period without modern medicine. But as the children grew older, it also fell to Elizabeth to help organise their marriages, especially for her eldest son, Arthur. In the late 1490s, she began correspondence with Queen Isabella of Castile to open negotiations for Arthur to marry Isabella's daughter Catherine, later to be known in England as Catherine of Aragon. On the 14th of November 1501, Catherine and Arthur were married. They set up home in Ludlow Castle, the traditional home of the Prince of Wales, and they seemed to care for one another. But their happiness, and that of Elizabeth and Henry, was not to last. Just a few months later, in the spring of 1502, the young couple both fell ill, possibly with either plague, a viral infection, or the dreaded sweating sickness. On the 2nd of April, Arthur, the hope for the Tudor dynasty and heir to the throne, died. Henry was inconsolable, both for the loss of his beloved son and his worries about his dynasty now he only had one son to continue after him. There is an account that gives a glimpse into the relationship between Elizabeth and Henry in the wake of their son's death. Henry apparently sent for the Queen to tell her the news himself and broke down in front of her. Elizabeth was selfless, comforting the king, reminding him that he was the only child of his mother, that he still had another son and 2 daughters, and that they were both still young enough to have more children. This last part was probably more to simply comfort them than being the truth, however. She held in her own grief, only collapsing in tears when she got to her own chambers. Elizabeth's attendants called for the king and he came immediately, this time comforting her, reminding Elizabeth of the wise advice she had given him. It is a touching story that, even if embellished, shows this was a marriage built on mutual love and understanding. Sadly, more tragedy was yet to come, and Henry would bear this one alone. In 1502, Elizabeth fell pregnant with her final child. It was unexpected when Elizabeth went into labour, as the baby was not expected until a few weeks later, so she would give birth in the Tower of London, where she was celebrating Candlemas with Henry. The small baby, clearly weak and struggling to thrive, was born on the 2nd of February 1503, the daughter named Catherine mentioned earlier, who would live for only a few days. It had been a difficult birth for Elizabeth, and she was reported to have been in great pain for most of it. She struggled to recover, and on the 9th of February, Elizabeth fell ill. The following day, on the 10th, Henry sent for a doctor from Plymouth, suggesting at that point no one felt there was any urgency. It's now thought most likely that she had caught a puerperal fever, a bacterial infection common at a time when people did not understand the importance of clean hands and equipment during giving birth. By the night of the 10th, she had worsened significantly, and it's clear Henry was panicked by this, sending for the Queen's personal physician from Gravesend, as well as paying for boatmen to hurry him up the Thames and horses with riders carrying torches to hasten his journey. Her doctor came as fast as he could, but he was sadly too late. In the early hours of the morning on the 11th of February, ironically her birthday, Queen Elizabeth died in the bed where she had given birth, just 37 years old. Henry appears to have been broken by the death of Elizabeth, and her absence would haunt him in many ways over the next few years until his own death in 1509. He grew ill after she died and would only allow his mother Margaret to come near him. His miserly nature also increased after his wife's death without her influence. The country itself was also cast into deep mourning for its popular queen. The Vaux Passional, an illuminated manuscript that belonged to Henry, reveals the aftermath of Elizabeth's death. Henry is in mourning robes, his expression grim. His two daughters wear black veils over their heads, and red-headed Prince Henry weeps into his mother's bedsheets. Elizabeth's death would also affect her son Henry for the rest of his life, and his obsession with finding the perfect wife may have begun with placing his deceased mother on a pedestal no other woman could reach. And finally, the Tower of London would never again be used as a royal residence. Elizabeth of York was one of the quietest of the women involved in the Wars of the Roses. She didn't start a war, didn't cause a scandal, and was known as a softly spoken and gentle queen consort. And yet her very existence would help seal the wounds caused by her ancestors' claims to the throne of England, as well as securing the country's stability alongside Henry VII. Her gentle, kind nature was the perfect complement to her husband's more serious, miserly nature, and she no doubt influenced him from behind the scenes, as well as fulfilling her duties as queen consort perfectly. She had been a well-liked and popular queen with her people, and she would be remembered as a paragon of queenly grace and humility. Although she only lived to be 37, Elizabeth of York had a full life that endured great tragedy, but also great joy, becoming a mother, a wife, a symbol of hope for Yorkists and Lancastrians alike, and becoming the queen she was always destined to become. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.